Here's my theory. While officially a reboot, there are things that make this fit nice and snug in the timeline of the Planet of the Apes. If you have any theories that could possibly disprove mine, please save your thoughts for the end of the video, as chances are I'll eventually get around to addressing those very same things you're thinking of telling me about. So yeah, spoilers! Rise of the Planet of the Apes. Our story begins in what we can only assume is our time. A scientist and gene therapist named Will Rodman, living in San Francisco, strives to find a cure for Alzheimer's and similar ailments, creating a retrovirus made to rebuild dying brain tissue and restore impaired functions. Some years ago, he tested on chimpanzees, now realizing one of his subjects is pregnant. Not quite sure how they missed that, but whatever. She is affected by the retrovirus and passes it on to her offspring, who develops very differently than the others of his species as a result. His mental capacity and ability to learn not only rivals but surpasses that of humans. Events lead Caesar, who we're going to call Caesar 1, to free hundreds of chimps, orangutans, gorillas, and other primates from captivity, and they gather in the redwood forest in hiding. During this revolution, only 2 humans are killed, one purely by accident. This pacifistic Caesar repeatedly demands that his companions refrain from killing innocent humans, desiring only freedom, and all the while retains his love for the people who raised him. Affected by the virus given to them by Caesar 1, this group of apes passes their newfound intelligence to their descendants, rapidly speeding up the evolution of their kind. Will, earlier in the film, tests the virus on his father, who is suffering dementia. For a time, it works, and the elderly man's condition improves beautifully. Unfortunately, his body's immune system, seeing the retrovirus as just a virus, beats it back and the positive effects of it fade. Will's father suffers again, but seeing that the retrovirus does indeed work, Will convinces his colleagues to beef up its power, hoping to make it aggressive enough for the effects to be made permanent, and they start testing on chimps again. However, these people want to rush the project and see how it affects humans as soon as possible. It turns out the new virus, while giving the apes more power, has devastating effects on humans. The carelessness of the geneticists leads to the new virus breaking out, causing a global pandemic that kills off much of the Earth's human population. Eventually, the apes naturally overpower us and replace humanity as the dominant species, as they continue to evolve along their own path while we spiral to our doom. Throughout the movie, we see things that more or less do tie this to other installments. A news report concerning a ship called the Icarus, on a mission led by George Taylor, is glimpsed later on in Rise, the ship presumably missing. Interestingly, the first plane shown carrying the virus that starts the pandemic is first shown landing in New York City, which in the other movies is known as the Forbidden Zone. It is possible that this place was hit the hardest, and it is also possible that the ensuing chaos led to a nuclear holocaust, as in the nuclear holocaust alluded to in the original film, Planet of the Apes, the original. George Taylor and the Icarus crew are whisked away from our time. Well, not exactly. The ship launched not in recent years, but in 1972. The crew stayed in hibernation or suspended animation for the duration of the voyage, supposedly moving at the speed of light the entire time. The news report in Rise did not hint at when the Icarus was launched, so I guess we can assume it was launched in the 70s. Humanity managed to keep track of it for roughly 40 years, assuming it's possible to keep track of light, and then lost track of it as it disappeared from our era. The ship may have been sucked into a wormhole that spit them out about 2,000 years later, and they wake up in a world where apes rule in our place. Humankind has branched out and been sent on 2 paths. In the first film, we see humans who typically don't speak but can learn to, and scavenge for whatever resources they can find in the wild, and sometimes steal from the apes' crops and whatnot. They are seen as little more than animals and a nuisance by the city-dwelling apes. It's a complete role reversal. The apes are shocked when they witness George speaking. George assumes he has landed on some other planet, not realizing that this is future Earth until the ending of the film. Throughout the film, it becomes increasingly evident that at one point, humans had a technologically advanced civilization that rose and fell. Dr. Zaius, arguably the film's antagonist, admits that he is aware of this, but will do everything in his power to ensure no other apes find out, as such knowledge could radically affect the simian society. Beneath the Planet of the Apes. The second group of humans are a band of mutants living deep underground in the Forbidden Zone, but we don't see them until the next film, Beneath the Planet of the Apes. These humans have retained much of what the surface dwellers have lost to the apes. They are also telepathic and somewhat disfigured thanks to centuries of exposure to nuclear fallout. Their greatest asset is the Alpha and Omega bomb, an idol they worship, a a leftover relic of war from our time with enough power to reduce the entire Earth to ashes. Eventually, the apes invade the Forbidden Zone and commence a battle thousands of years in the making. In the end, the bomb is detonated not by the mutants, but by none other than Taylor of all people, when Zeus makes it clear to him that apes and humans can never hope to coexist as things are. With his last breath, he takes the world and everyone on it out with him. However, while this is technically the end of the Planet of the Apes timeline, this is where things get really interesting. Escape from the Planet of the Apes. Miraculously, just as the future Earth becomes space dust, 3 apes, characters featured in the previous 2 films, managed to repair Taylor's ship and ride the force of the explosion through a time warp back the way Taylor came. Yeah. They arrive in 1973, just a year after the Icarus was originally launched. The apes become celebrities, but eventually blurt out the fate of the human race, and as a result are hunted down. A man named Dr. Otto Hasslein feels that the best way to ensure men's continued dominance, and possibly change the future altogether, is to preemptively kill our heroes, one of whom is pregnant. In the end, they are killed, including a newborn baby primate. But it's not the one Hasslein was looking for. Turns out Zira, the mother, switched it at the last minute with a circus monkey's baby. This creature would grow up to be a new incarnation of Caesar. We'll call him Caesar 2. And with that, the apes from the future, the apes who are a product of the events of Rise, have effectively replaced the world the original Caesar was born in, with an alternate reality that, apparently, still somehow leads to the future they came from. This creates a time loop, in which these characters will continue to be born in the future that was a product of Caesar 1, now overlapped, if not completely undone by these new events that they've set off, that the future they came from is now a product of instead, and coming to the past to set off these events, and it just keeps going around and around and around infinitely in a time and space we can't possibly hope to completely understand. The world Caesar 1 was born in is where this was all started, but the future has been renewed with this time loop, and created the world of Caesar 2. Conquest of the Planet of the Apes. As early as 3 decades before today, the world of Caesar 2 is already very different from our world that Caesar 1 from Rise was born in. Many common household pets are facing extinction, so people are commonly adopting primates instead. Over time, the apes are treated less and less as pets or companions, and more like slaves. Born with the name Milo, but later renamed Caesar, our protagonist is raised by Armando, a circus man who sheltered Caesar II's parents when Zira brought him into this new world made just for him. Caesar II was kept safe from the evils of this world for a while, but events including the death of his caregiver Armando push him over the edge. He leads a far more aggressive revolt than the first Caesar did, eventually gathering enough apes and enough power to potentially conquer the planet. Here's where things get a bit iffy. Conquest of the Planet of the Apes has 2 endings. One ending showed Caesar II allowing his soldiers to brutally bludgeon the few surviving humans of the revolt's launch, possibly including a man who helped Caesar II start his revolt, to death, showing that he is indeed a very, very different Caesar to the one we know in Rise. However, this ending proved to be too much for viewers, so an alternate ending was slapped on at the last minute, in which Caesar II instead makes a speech about how he will change the future by treating the humans with tolerance and decency, even if we do ultimately wind up subordinate to the apes after all. It's hard to say which ending is true. Some, including myself, prefer the original ending, mainly because it segues more smoothly into the final film, Battle for the Planet of the Apes. Going by the new ending, the final film may as well not even exist. The story could end right here. So I guess we'll go with the bloody ending, for the sake of the final chapter. Before we go that far, let's talk about some more ties with Rise. In Escape, an ape from the future named Cornelius tells a legend about the apes rising to power when one amazingly gained the power of speech and said no to his human captors. In Rise, Caesar 1 does just that, so from a certain point of view, one could rightfully assume the legend is about him. However, in Conquest, a gorilla named Aldo does this instead. This is an alternate timeline with different circumstances, and one could think it interferes with Rise being a part of the timeline as a whole. But it actually works, since before and after the time loop starts, even without Caesar 1 existing anymore, we still have someone there to fulfill this, and keep the legend alive. One thing that could prove my theory wrong, though, is a scene in Escape. One of the things Caesar II's parents expose is information regarding the widespread death of cats and dogs and whatnot that leads to the events of Conquest. Some may think this means Rise was never a part of the timeline to begin with, since such things didn't happen in that movie. But this could possibly just be another effect of the infinite time loop. For all we know, the escape from the Planet of the Apes we see could take place after the time loop has already started, taken effect, and been etched into the walls of time, flushing out the old Caesar's world entirely. Now we move on to the final film of the franchise, chronologically speaking. We're almost done. Battle for the Planet of the Apes. Some decades after the events of the last film, an aged Caesar II, his advancing simian society, and the dwindling humans are creating things we find out about in the original two films. We get to see things like the Alpha and Omega bomb prepped up for their uses in those movies. At the end of this movie, things get a little odd. When all is said and done, Caesar II welcomes humanity into his new world despite all their past transgressions, finally bringing closure to this epic saga, for better or for worse. We then cut to 600 years later, in a time where humans and apes live side by side as cousins. At this point, we're left to assume that the new Caesar has righted all wrongs and created a new future, better and gentler than the world that Taylor gave up on and destroyed. Here's what makes this strange. If we're to assume there is indeed a time loop, then for the time loop to keep going, it has to lead back where it started. If Caesar II erases the world of the original two films, the world his parents came from, then his parents may be erased too, destroying his place of origin. This could create a time paradox that prevents Caesar II from ever being born, because a time loop wouldn't complete its cycle even once, and may as well have never started. The world Taylor got to know has to exist. Despite this Caesar's efforts, somewhere in the 1400 years between battle's ending and the Beneath's beginning, those efforts must go to waste and lead back to where we started. And who's to say that's not possible? For all we know, in that time some cruel, power-hungry apes could cause a regression and undo everything Caesar II accomplished, making humanity the underdog again. Plus, the presence of such things as the Alpha and Omega bomb seem to suggest that this does in some way ultimately lead to the future we know, so the roles of such things could be fulfilled. This would keep the time loop going, even if Caesar II only managed to prolong the inevitable for a few hundred years. The only way Caesar II's time loop could be interrupted without his world being erased is if done so by another time loop that closes the gap somehow. But this is already getting too complicated, so yeah. In case you guys are still having trouble getting the gist of my theory, well, here's a few ways I can see this going down. Theory 1. Events are witnessed in this order: Rise, Original, Beneath, Escape, Conquest, Battle, Original, Beneath, Escape, Conquest, Battle, etc. In this time, we see everything begin with Caesar I and Rise. But once a time loop comes full circle, we see Rise cut out of the cycle and never popping up again. Nevertheless, it did happen, at least once. Theory 2. Events are seen in this order: Rise, Original, Beneath, Escape, Conquest, Battle, and that's it. See, my theory can only be supported by the assumption that the time loop keeps going, like a wheel that spins around again and again and again and just never stops. This new theory is supported by the assumption that the time loop stops after completing a cycle once. It still happens, but only one time. And if the time paradox ends up having no effect, then it is possible that Caesar II does change the future and finish the unsuccessful work of Caesar I and Taylor's failed future. Theories 3 and 4 are basically the first two theories, minus Rise of the Planet of the Apes ever being a part of the timeline. If you just don't like the idea of the new film being tied to the other films, if you think some things just aren't supposed to be explained, and, we should be left to wonder where the time loop ever started but never actually see, well, then fine, by all means, go with these theories. Well, that's my take on the Planet of the Apes, and how Rise more or less fits into the timeline. I hope you found this entertaining, or at least informative. So, yeah. Toodles!